What is up, everybody? Welcome back here to the channel. We're back on their top 25. We finally made the top 2 after all this time. We've got Georgia Bulldogs on the docket. We're going to be talking about Georgia. They're coming in number 2 in this preseason ranking for the Athletic. We're going to be talking about their recruiting. What does that look like? Impact players, losses, all of the above. Transfers they brought in, their schedule, and hey, can they bounce back from that one loss they had last year? We're going to talk about last year's team here, and we laugh because they won 2 national titles in a row, and then they were one loss away from going back to the playoff and probably being the favorite. You know, even as a Michigan fan, it's one of those things where it's like, I'm glad I didn't really necessarily see Georgia. Like, I'm actually kind of glad about that. And when you watch, you know, the loss that they had was against Alabama in that SEC title game, in a game that, you know, back and forth, they could have won that game. It's 27-24. It was very, very close. And then they went and just beat the crap out of Florida State JV squad out there in the Orange Bowl. But they looked very good last year. You know, that man is back. Carson Beck, he had almost 4,000 yards passing last year, 24 touchdowns, 6 interceptions in his first real year, really playing and starting there. So you're going to expect that development. Obviously, the running back room is really by committee. Milton, Edwards, they were all kind of back there. And really, they just spread the ball around. They had a big loss. His name is Brock Bowers. I don't know if you guys have heard him. That was definitely a huge loss for them from a receiving standpoint, from a tight end standpoint. But this team was good last year when you're looking at it. And from an offensive standpoint, you know, coming in with that new offensive coordinator and kind of looking, okay, how are these guys going to develop there? They looked pretty good last year. They were a top 5 unit, 40 points per game, almost just under that. Third down conversion rate, they were number 1 in the country last year, third down conversion rate. 55%. So they stayed on the field in third down. They did a very good job there. A lot of that is play calling. A lot of that is scheme. Like, you have to like what they've done there in terms of kind of how they built this team around Beck and some of those other guys that are on that roster. And overall, the offense is really good. Rushing offense is really efficient. They were a top 10 unit yards per rush. Passing offense, they were very efficient there. They were a top 2 unit. And completion percentage, yards per pass, they were top 10 units. So very, very solid. I mean, what can we say about Georgia? They are one of the Kirby Smart has built a giant there ever since kind of coming over there, and they've done a great job. They lost one game, and one could argue they lost Alabama. Why did they get left out? Obviously, now that they're in an extended playoff, we're going to see them in the playoff pretty much almost every year. I'd be shocked if we don't see them in the playoff every year. But what are we looking at for this season's offense, Christian?
Probably a better offensive line than what we got last year, if only because last year Amarius Mims did play 7 games. Cedric Van Pran Granger was their starting center, and both of those players were fantastic. But Ernest Green, the third, taking a step forward is expected. He played a lot of snaps last year, and the athleticism is certainly there. Xavier Truss taking a step forward as those 2 bookend tackles. And then that middle of the offensive line looks terrifying. Tate Ratledge might be the best one in the country. Dylan Fairchild is fantastic as well. And Jared Wilson, when he played last year, was good, as expected from a Georgia offensive line these days. I think, you know, my main question about this team is actually the running back room for the first time in a long time for Georgia. Trevor Etienne is going to lead that group, it seems. Roderick Robinson and Branson Robinson are behind him. And I personally was never a huge fan of those two. I think they have a very specific style. I'm curious to see if they can lean on the run as much as they have. But the good thing is that they also have the best quarterback that they've had in a long, long time. You know, Carson Beck is better than Stetson Bennett, despite Stetson Bennett winning 2 national titles. Beck has more talent, and he can distribute the ball a lot better. I think this passing attack is going to be just as efficient. Dylan Bell is one of the more underrated wide receivers in the nation. He was really good for them last year. Dominic Lovett came over. There was like an adjustment period, but I really like Lovett. And then Colby Young transferring in, Benjamin Urosic transferring in. This is a Georgia offense that should score a ton of points again. And I don't really have too many concerns about that aspect of this team.
Yeah, I know fans last year were a little worried about Mike Bobo being there. And, you know, I thought that the game and the play call and everything got a little bit better towards the end of the year. And you saw that a little bit. I think this offense clicked a little bit. And yeah, I think to your point, running back room is an interesting spot, right? Trevor Etienne is good. But like when you go through Etienne stuff and you look at kind of, you know, is he that game breaking back? I don't know. I don't think so. I think that he's definitely kind of like that change of pace kind of guy. He definitely can have explosive at the line of scrimmage and stuff. But then Roderick Robinson and Branson Robinson, these guys got to come back, right? Branson off the injury. Roderick is fun. Like Roderick is that thunder guy that you have to see there. But they're, you know, utilizing that kind of, you know, that committee is definitely something that they're going to have to do. And a big reason why, you know, they lost their running backs, Kendall, Me and
We
Christian love
love
our
him.
Kendall Milton. Like I don't know what happened, but Kendall, we're still believing you out there. Dejon Edwards as well. I think from a pass catching perspective there. Brock Bowers, Marius Mims, Ra Thomas got released from the team this offseason after some unfortunate and dumb mistakes that he made in the off field in terms of that. But to me, the big loss is Brock. But they definitely brought in. They have Oscar Delp, who just hasn't gotten that run. When Brock was injured a couple of times, Oscar kind of stepped in there. Ben Urasek from Stanford is a fantastic receiving tight end. Brock was one of their best players for three years. Like he was fantastic out there. So that to me really stands out. And then really it's hard to judge what the wide receivers are notable losses or not because they just don't get involved. They just don't use them as much. So it's just hard to say like, yeah, those wide receivers are huge losses based on what their identity is.
Yeah, and I was a big Rosemary Jackson fan. I thought he
Mm-hmm.
was, underrated a bit last year, but also he wasn't one of their three best wide receivers, I would say, or at least their two best, because their two best are still returning in Lovett and Dylan Bell. So, and that's not to take anything from Arian Smith either, who's like flashed a lot of potential
Yeah.
at times too. So like they have dudes, and Colby Young. I thought that was a fantastic get. It seems more like he's going to be that fourth wideout this year, from everything I was reading. But with injuries and stuff, like I actually think this wide receiver room probably got better despite losing Rosemary Jackson and Rara Thomas this offseason. So yeah, Brock Bowers is the most impactful piece to their receiving core that they're losing. But I'm a huge fan of Delp. I think that he's just been, he needed some more time to develop, I think, as a pass catcher last year, but I think he offers just as much as a blocker. I
Mm-hmm.
think he can be a factor for this offense.
Oh yeah, 12 personnel. Like I don't see two tight ends out there, a better tight end room out there in college football based on what they're getting
No.
from those guys. And from a recruiting standpoint, hey, who guessed it? Georgia recruits. They did a great job. I mean, that's what they do. Number one recruiting class. So they were the number one recruiting class in 2024. Composite rank was number one as well. So they went out there and got guys. Daniel Calhoun. The important thing, we just talked about that when we talked about, hey, who are they bringing in? They brought in a ton of running backs in this room, and they really went after him. Dwight Phillips, he comes in at number 21 rated running back there, and very, very solid. And then Nate Frazier's kind of the good one, the big one, right? Number 2 in 247 Sports, and on three is number 3 guy, 5'9", 206, definitely has that role. Might get a little bit of run this year. We'll see. I mean, they don't necessarily get in the freshman there. Chauncey Bowens as well. I mean, he's number 40 rated running back. In a lot of places, he would have been a starter possibly this year at the smaller schools and definitely a rotational guy. So they definitely went out and got guys. I mean, this is what you expect from this. Tuggle is a guy I think is interesting from a wide receiver perspective. A lot of people love Tuggle, and then he signed with Georgia, and you know how the bumps go down a little bit for Georgia wide receivers on the recruiting trail, but they definitely crushed it for their tackles as well.
Yeah, I wanted to save the Nate Frazier talk for this, and he wasn't on the depth chart, and I think that's just because they haven't had to use freshmen all that much, except for in like spot roles. I think Frazier has a shot to get on the field this year, just with the construct of that running back room. I like Tuggle a lot. I think he's a really good player. I don't think he'll see the field much this year. I also wanted to note that I couldn't even fit all of the recruits that they brought in onto this graphic. So there are a couple more guys that just didn't make it. So that speaks to the depth of this class. This is what we see from Georgia every single year. Those offensive tackles, man, some of those boys are fun to watch. The 6'7", 365, 6'7", 335. I like seeing the big old guys move around. So and Georgia is one of the best at recruiting them at this point. So really great class as usual. I don't have any notes for Kirby over there.
Yeah, if Georgia calls, people say yes. I mean, it's that simple. If
Yep.
they're offering you, they're going there now. They're the new Alabama when it comes to recruiting. I think that Kirby's going to own that, even with NIL. I know he made the Oregon joke, and we talked about Oregon last time about the money that they got out there. Georgia has money too. Let's not pretend Kirby and them don't have money out there for the NIL on that area. Now, we look at transfers. They brought in good transfer class. Trevor Etienne, impact player, probably a starter. Benjamin Urasek, starter. I mean, in 12 personnel, definitely. But he's going to get out there. He can also move to the slot. So if Georgia fans have it, I'm sure Georgia fans, because you guys are all nuts, you've watched him. But if you haven't watched Urasek, I think the big thing about him is his versatility. He can be in line as a blocker, but he can also be in the slot. Jane Rashada was a guy that was highly recruited by Florida. Then that didn't work out. Went to Arizona State, dealt with some injuries, some other things going on there. But he could be an interesting piece in there. Michael Jackson, Colby Young, which we mentioned, some other guys, but they had a great transfer portal class.
Yeah, this class, especially for, I think Georgia's done a good job over the last couple of years in getting transfers in, but it wasn't a place where we were talking about them, being a coveted spot to go, especially for the wide receivers, the pass catchers, and the skill position players, because that's never been Georgia.
Yeah.
But getting a backup quarterback and potentially third string quarterback as good as Jaden Rashada to come
Mhm.
in and compete for next year, knowing that he's sitting, he and Dante Moore from UCLA to Oregon kind of did the same thing where they're like, okay, this didn't really work out. I'm going to go learn behind a guy that is going to go to the NFL in some way. Dylan Gabriel, maybe not, but Carson Beck, definitely. And so now you've got a young quarterback to build around on top of all your recruits that you've already had in there. Gunnar Stockton, I think if given a shot, could start at a lot of places. And I think the same is true of Rashada. This class is great. I do wish they would have hit the running back room one more time, just from our conversation earlier. But overall, I mean, you can't really complain when you've got impact players across the board here.
Yeah, no, 100%. When you're talking about the impact players, Carson Beck, Oscar Dell, ETN, Dominic Lovett, really, to me, it comes down to Carson Beck. Here's the thing with Carson Beck. Yeah, the numbers were good last year. 72% completion percentage, almost 4,000 yards. Yards per attempt, 9.5. Air yards attempt is 10. Pretty good there. He had some throws on tape where you're like, holy shit, this guy's an NFL quarterback. He makes, tight ropes over the middle, able to step up, get to the sidelines, get to the numbers, those type of things. However, there was also times where you're like, what? This guy's not taking over this game. Like, I felt like that in the Alabama game because they should have won that game, I think, in the SEC title game. And, whether it was the coaching, the play call, Bobo not trusting him, or whatever the case may be, I never was like nervous with him back there. If I was an Alabama fan, like, oh man, this guy's going to get us. Like, it felt like it was more like Bowers, right? Brock was that guy. Hey, get it to him and those type of things. So Beck's really got to take over games. I think that's the key for them is like, can Beck win games? Like you just said, the running back depth might not be there. So they're going to ask Carson maybe to throw a little bit more. Maybe they're going to ask him to go win those games. And will he do that? Now, I think he's going to develop it. He could be the QB1 of the class. But that's, I think, the big question mark surrounding this offense.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. And maybe that's a product of this scheme in this offense because, leading up to that last national title, there were reports that Carson Beck was outplaying Stetson Bennett, but Stetson Bennett ran the offense the way Kirby Smart wanted it run. And so you wonder how much of that is them not giving him freedom to do those things. I do hope they give him the reins a little bit this year and say, you need to go win us these games because you are one of the most talented quarterbacks in the nation. I think that's totally fair. I do have him as I believe my QB2 at this point. But he looks like a potential first rounder. He does need to take a step forward. And I think a big part of that is going to be how good can Delp be? How good can Lovett be? Dylan Bell, all of these other guys around him. And I think he's in a pretty good position to do those things and take those steps.
Yeah, no, 100%. Now, when we're talking about the defense, last year, top 10 in points allowed, right? So 16.3 looked pretty good. Like opponent third down conversion, they were number 3 in the nation. So they got teams off on third down. Very good there. From a run defense perspective, they were a top 30 unit. Nothing crazy, but they were still solid. They were good. From a pass defense, they were okay. I think the number that stands out to me, and we'll probably dive into this, their sack percentage. They were 57th last year on sacks in terms of, actually going after the quarterback. And their leading sack getter was Jalen Walker at 5. And then I know they had a bunch of different little guys in there. Michael Williams at 4.5. Jamin Dumas Johnson had 3.5. But when we think of Georgia coming after the quarterback and kind of creating those turnovers, I think they lack that. Like, that's the big number when you're looking at all kind of like, hey, opponent interception thrown, 44th. Like, those takeaways weren't really there, right? We saw that against Alabama in those other games where it's like, man, usually we see those great corners, we see those defensive linemen getting after guys. They didn't have that last year. I think that is the number. That's the area they got to improve this year.
Yeah, and I think Williams, Michael Williams is going to be that guy this year. There were a lot of signs last year of a guy that is ready to take that next step and be a top 3, top 5 pick. And they've been turning out, top draft picks from their defense for a while now. He's a guy that I think will take that next step. Warren Brinson on the inside gave them some really good snaps last year. I think that him being more of a pocket collapser will be critical for this team to get more sacks. Dalen Everett's going to have to take a bit of a step forward here. He was up and down last year. He played in 14 games. He played 600 snaps. So he was out there a ton. He actually played the fourth most snaps on their entire team, but it was up and down. So if he takes a step forward, when you have a guy like Malachi Starks back there, which I can't believe I buried the lead with that, you have a little bit more freedom to develop because Starks is a top 10 talent in the 2025 draft if he declares. So you've got that going for you. I do think that this defense, while like the name recognition once again is not as high as maybe the 2021 2022 teams, because we know how legendary those two defenses were. There's still a ton of playmaking, really talented players here that I think, if the offense does falter a little bit or sputter at times, I think that this defense can carry them to wins, which is, I think we could say that happened a bit last year, but because there were no game records and things like that out there, I think that it made it a little more difficult. It looks to me like this team will be a little bit better than last year.
Yeah, and Williams, he's transitioned from D-line to like outside linebacker, kind of up there, that DN kind of role where he's up, and he looked great in the scrimmage. So if that's the case, I mean, that's the thing. He's going to take off in that new role. The losses really come down to the secondary. Lassiter, Tyke Smith, and Javon Bullard, like those guys, they're essentially replacing three starters and those guys. And like, yeah, there's talent there, but I do think that there is some competitions that are going to get sprung out right now in August, trying to figure out who's going to start back there.
Yeah, and that's like I think that's the main question, but I think you're hoping that Malachi Starks can kind of be so good that it eliminates some of that. And he's been good since he's been a freshman, so I think we could see another step forward. And so if you have that certainly eases the load on that. I put Marvin Jones Jr. on here as well because while he wasn't super good for them or impactful last year, he was on the field for 250-ish snaps. So it is a guy that they'll have to replace, especially when you're looking to get some sack production. But yeah, that secondary certainly took more losses than any other area of their team.
Well, lucky for them, they recruit like bats out of hell. They got Ellis Robinson, and not just Ellis Robinson as you go through there, DeMello Jones and some of those other guys. But to me, Ellis was the big get, right? #1 rated corner last year out of Florida at IMG last year. They talked about him just being, he's worked in man and zone. They said he does a great job there. He's very good in both, so they love that. He said the anticipation, they're able to kind of get turnovers, takeaways, and just get the quarterback to throw where they want. They want to throw, and all of a sudden he's there. He takes it away from them. 36-inch vertical jump recorded in high school, so you have to love that. He posted like a 4.52 in the 40-yard dash, so he's around that speed. Like, this kid projects as like a potential, cornerback one on a playoff team. Hey, this is Georgia's guy moving forward, but he could definitely get in the rotation. There's some upside there from this year in that room, and it'd be interesting to see if he gets out there early.
Oh yeah, this class is insane. I do, when I'm going through these recruits, I take a look at the player comps before I take a look at them and see if I kind of see that on their highlights or their film. Ellis Robinson was compared to Greg Newsome, who has been one of the better corners in the NFL. Justin Williams was compared to Darius Leonard, who was an all-pro linebacker. Yeah. KJ Bolden is compared to Eddie Jackson, who was a Pro Bowl starting safety. And then interesting for you, Chris Cole got a Junior Colson comparison. So when you think about what Colson was able to do for the linebacking room in Michigan last year, that's a solid top 4 of your class, and then filling it out with mostly 4 stars the rest of the way. This is Georgia. That all of these guys are going to be, a lot of these guys probably won't even see the field for them before they transfer out, which is the unfortunate part. But the rule of numbers says that 3, 4, 5 of these guys are going to be impact players in 2 to 3 years. 2 of them might be impact players this year. So good class once again.
No, I mean, a couple of those guys can be top 10 picks. Like, that's how talented they are. And then if I draft them 3 years, we're like, oh yeah, here they are. We're talking to it and going through it. And for transfers, they didn't go get a ton. Colin Gill, Jake Pope, and Xavier McLeod. McLeod to me is the guy coming over from South Carolina. Very, very talented kid. I mean, and right now he's listed at 6'4", 315, defensive lineman out there. That's Georgia to a T right there. You have to love that. He was the number 11 defensive tackle last year when he went to South Carolina in high school. Obviously didn't play a ton last year. He had 51 tackles his senior year, 17 tackles for loss, 45 tackles the previous year. Like, he's pretty good, and he's going to definitely give them that rotational piece there. Jake Pope, Colin Gill. I mean, these are fine pieces to just plug holes.
Yeah, Gill's an interesting one to me just because they have so much need in that secondary. Pope is okay.
Yeah.
He was a former 4-star. Gill was a former 3-star, but I think it is noteworthy if Georgia's willing to accept you into their program that they see something in you. I think they can be that selective. So,
Oh yeah.
I wouldn't be shocked if all three of these guys get on the field a little bit this year. I think you're right that McLeod would be the guy that I think is gonna make it and be an actual part of the rotation this year.
Yeah, big boy, and he can definitely kind of fill a need down up there at that defensive line. Just a rotational piece. They're going to need that as they
Mhm.
chart and they go through that SEC schedule. Yeah. So impact players, Malachi Starks. We've been talking about him. Those two guys, Michael Williams and Malachi Starks. This defense is gonna be around those guys. Like that is really where they're
Mhm.
at. And if they play at the level they can win a national title, right? Like I think that there's 3 teams to me that can win a national title. Georgia's one of them in terms of that, but the reason why is because of Williams and Starks. Brinson as well, Everett, those guys, but Starks and Williams to me, that's where it starts, that's where it stops, just like I'm Beck on the other side.
Yeah, I'm with you on those fronts. I do think that those are the two most important pieces, but I think from a structure of that defense, I think Everett just has to be a lot better. And so if he's not, I could see a world in which this secondary gives up some points, and that could be problematic. But to me, yeah, everything starts and ends with Starks and Williams. I think they are 2 top 10 players next year, and I cannot wait to watch them once again on this Georgia defense because, boy, oh boy, are they fun to watch too. That's the thing. This team is so fun to watch on defense because they just fly around, Starks especially.
Yeah.
But I think he has a case to be a top 5 pick as well as Williams this year. So I'm ready to see it.
Yeah. Now, when you get into the schedule, over under 10.5. They're up there. That big game one, Clemson. I can't wait for that game. I'm gonna be excited for that one. Then they go Tennessee Tech, Kentucky, then at Alabama. I mean, that is with DeBoer being there. They want to win that game versus Auburn, Mississippi State at Texas versus Florida, Ole Miss, Tennessee, UMass, and Georgia Tech. This is a tough schedule. Like we've laughed about Georgia's schedule in the past. Like, oh my gosh, look at this schedule. There's no way they're gonna lose and all that. There's some losses on this potentially here. Like there is definitely some losses there. They're going to be probably favorites in every single game. I'd be shocked if they weren't, but definitely some losses here, possibly. Where you at with the over under 10.5?
It's tough because I think at Alabama we can write that off as Georgia should win that football game, and really they should win it comfortably, just with the status of those two teams.
Yeah.
But going to Alabama is difficult. You've mentioned Auburn as one of those like sneaky teams this year where you have to take them seriously. I think they get through that one at Texas. That's the one game where I don't know if they'll be favored because Texas is so good. They're right here in the top 5 as well. I see a loss there, but I think they get through the rest. I think they're able to shut down Nico and Tennessee. I think they can go to Ole Miss and just bully that offensive line around. Maybe the defensive line holds up a little bit better, but Carson Beck should be able to win that game. I'm going over, but 11. I think they do snag a loss somewhere in there.
I think they lose once. I don't know who. I don't know where it's at, but they're going to lose once on that schedule. I have over 2. I think 11-1 is where they're at. I think they are one of the most talented teams in college football there. And I think they get held up one of those games. I'm not a I don't even know how to say the word, so I'm not even going to try. When I'm looking at the schedule, man, it's tough. I do think the Florida game is tough. I know they're rivals, and I think they will whoop Florida's butt like they have in the past. And where Florida's at, that game is just going to depend because their schedule. But they're talented. Like Florida's talented. Tennessee with Nico, talent. Ole Miss, Jackson Dart, and they're playing a lot of very veteran quarterbacks. So like if they're playing veteran quarterbacks, I think anything can happen in these games here. But that first game is going to tell us a little bit. It's going to all right. What's Clemson at, and what's Georgia at, and how does that look there? Now, as far as the outlook goes, we know what they are. They're national title contenders every single year. And I think that based on their roster, we're going to be talking about Ohio State in our next video as the number 1 team out there in terms of rated. Ohio State and Oregon are, to me, the only teams that can win a national title this year. And it really comes down to health. I think defensively, can they stop kind of that, up front, will they be able to stop in the SEC? I do think they match up very, very good with Ohio State if they do face them at some point in the playoff, just because of that defense, but also offensively, I think they can put pressure on that Ohio State defense from the different ways in their skill positions. So I like Georgia. I do think Georgia is going to be in the Final Four. In terms of where it's at, I think it's just going to come down to seeding if they have to play Oregon or not. But I could see them definitely win a national title. They're right there.
Yeah, I'd throw a fourth team personally, and I think Texas is right in that group with those three.
Now they keep losing running backs. They're going to have to get you or me off the
I know
portal or something.
I know. Well, it's just putting more stress on Quinn Ewers to take a step forward. But yeah, I mean, this Georgia team looks as ready. You know, we think about those Stetson Bennett teams and how they were constructed. It was very much so based on that defense. This is a more balanced team, I think, on both sides of the ball. So I'm excited to watch them. I do think they're an 11-win team. I think they're a top 4. I think they win the SEC when all is said and done. If they can get into that SEC championship game, I don't see them losing that this year. So they're going to be fun to watch. I think a Georgia-Ohio State rematch would be a lot of fun until you start to consider that Will Howard's Ohio State's quarterback. And then you're like, oh, yeah, Georgia would win that pretty easily. So, Georgia's in a good spot as always. They always will be. And we're going to talk about them in the top 5 every single year that we do.
Every single year. And Georgia fans, you should be excited about that. I mean, that's what you guys have. You're recruiting at a high level. And the expanded playoff only helps you guys because if you're in it, you have a shot to win it every single year, just based on the talent that you got bringing there. So appreciate you guys, Georgia fans. What do you think? Are you over under at that number? And then, hey, how do you think you match up with Ohio State? Because I think that's really what we're talking about here. And Oregon, like, how do you feel about those matchups? I would love to see a Georgia-Oregon final, partly because I hate Ohio State, and secondly, just because of Dan Lanning and Kirby Smart and just like all that. I think that'd be a fantastic storylines out there for both those programs. So appreciate you guys. We'll check you guys on our last one, number 1, Ohio State, next time.